Roll it.
Die looks good. Ja, uitstekend, maar is goed.
I would stay for
Apa pindah senang?
Hah?
Pindah senang.
Sudah. Biar kami.
Welcome to Kukusan namik, kukusu, budget tu. Telespik. Itu. Kukusan namik, kukusu, budget tu.
Typically, the greatest concern to anyone who first goes kayaking is to make sure they don't tip over. That fear of capsizing overrides everything else. Well, by learning to roll, and learning to roll very well, and learning to actually enjoy rolling, you can completely eliminate that fear and truly become one with the water. So here's what I like to do. I get in my kayak, and I paddle a short distance from shore, and then I start rolling. And I practice some slow, fast, left, right, work on some old ones, work on some new ones, and then after maybe an hour or so, I paddle back to shore and go home. That's a good day on the water. So whereas originally the biggest concern was not tipping over, now the whole point is to tip over. It wouldn't be any fun if you couldn't tip over. You'll often see these rolling techniques done in very narrow, very low volume Greenland style kayaks, such as this one. Now, I can't deny that the design of the kayak does have some bearing on how easy or how difficult it is to do a particular roll. However, these techniques can be applied to a wide variety of different kayaks. Now, there's a tremendous temptation to blame your kayak for not being able to do a particular roll. The expensive solution is to just go out and buy another kayak. But you can do a lot more than you think you can in the kayak you have. For example, all the rolls you'll see demonstrated in this video, I learned how to do in a Feathercraft Kahuna with a 25-inch beam. And each time I saw a new roll and tried it, when I failed, I figured I'd gone as far as I could in the kayak that I had. But since I couldn't afford another one, I kept on practicing and eventually got those rolls to work and got all the way up to hand rolls, closed fist rolls, elbow rolls in a kayak with a 25-inch beam. So in general, don't blame your kayak. And we'll look at specific ways you can modify and adjust your kayak to squeeze every last advanced roll you can out of the kayak you have. When we go out paddling, we're going to be in an environment with potential hazards such as waves, wind, stuff that could tip you over and potentially do you harm. So the strategy to survive can be looked at a couple different ways. And so one method is, if you're stronger and more powerful than anything that's trying to hurt you, then you come back alive, you survive. So big waves getting ready to knock you over, if you can beat it back down and subdue that adversary, then you win. But there's a different philosophy, and I think that's the one that applies more to this paddle, and that is, if you make peace with your surroundings, and if the water is your friend, you're not looking to beat that opponent down, you're looking as a friend that can help you. And so with that philosophy, you do more something like just lay down in the water and use the water to cushion your fall, because the water is your friend. So going back to the first strategy, if you're trying to beat something down and wield all this power, you need lots of strength, and you need to be wound up like a spring so you can unleash that strength at a moment's notice. However, the other way, where the water is your friend, the paddle is no longer a weapon. The paddle is more like a tool for dancing. And so for dancing, what dancers spend all day doing, unlike fighters, is they need strength, but they need strength just applied certain times at just the right amount, the right timing. They need more than that, is flexibility. And so this sort of thing requires a good amount of flexibility and a completely free torso rotation. That's how the Greenland paddle should be thought of philosophically, as it's dancing, it's not fighting. The key to mastering these rolls is developing full flexibility in the waist and hip region. And here's a little thing you can do. This isn't so much an exercise as an evaluation technique. You're going to sit on the ground like this with your feet straight out, and then take your head down as far as you can go and keep it as low to the ground as you can all the way around and back. Now, if you think you'll never be able to do that, think again. You can work up to that. Try yoga. That's a good idea. You can't go wrong doing yoga to be a better paddler. There's another thing you might want to try, and that is a form of rope gymnastics that was invented by the very people who invented kayaks a long time ago. Check out my other video called Kayak. But whatever range of motion you have, try to translate that to the kayak. So here we have a kayak with all the gear on it for a typical day of paddling. Now, if we're going to do that same 360 degrees mobility exercise, obviously there are a lot of problems here. For starters, this hydration pack is not letting me get much farther back than that. On the side here, I've got too much in this pocket here for allowing me to get over this far. And underneath this PFD, I have a nylon spray skirt with shoulder straps, which hinders my movement back in all directions quite a bit. If I replace it with neoprene, I have a lot more flexibility. And then finally, for the forward, I've got this in the way. So by eliminating all that, I can get a little bit closer to that idea of 360 degrees. And that's what we need for dancing rather than fighting. In order to control the kayak, you need to have solid contact from the waist down. Now, in a typical low volume Greenland design, that's pretty difficult not to do, because to get into these kayaks, you almost have to hyperextend your knees. And once you're in there, that piece called the masik is right against your thighs, and you are one with the kayak. Pretty much whatever your legs do, the kayak's going to do as well. But if you go to a higher volume design, these cockpits are so long that you can sit right down in them, and if your legs are as short as mine, you can just drop right in, and the knees are not underneath the deck, so that if I'm bracing and I try to turn the kayak, if I don't have a solid contact there, the knee can just slip right out. So this is where a little outfitting there can help, or some of the designs have these extra little tabs that you can brace your knee against. If you go to a wreck boat, much wider design, you can't really use the day paddler's position with the legs straight out, because you'll just flop around in there. When you try to roll, you'll turn your body and the kayak just stays where it wants to go. So you need to get your knees all the way out to the side, and that usually means pulling the foot pedals up a good deal farther than used to having them, and bracing in there solidly so that when you move, the kayak moves. So we'll take the evaluation procedure we did earlier a step further by going out 9 degrees and turning all the way upright till we can get our shoulders just about flat to the ground. Now the knees are going to turn all the way to down and then all the way to back up again, and that twisting from the hips there while you're facing up is the foundation for all the layback rolls. The Greenland paddle was designed to be used all the way up and down the shaft from one end to the other. If your paddle won't fit comfortably in your hand all the way to the end, then you should get something that's narrower with the blade. For any of these rolls, you can extend the paddle as much or as little as you want. That's what it's designed for. To brace, you put your paddle out to the side of the kayak and push down on it to come up. A sweep is done bracing while the paddle is moving. So you sweep the paddle across the water while you put pressure on it. Some rolls are best done with more of a sweeping action, some are better with a bracing action. You can use whatever works best for you, but the smoothest rolls are done with a little bit of each action. Now if you sweep and then change directions and sweep back and keep doing that, that's called sculling. And the Greenland paddle is designed to scull extremely well. You can learn to roll before you learn to scull, but traditionally it's taught the other way around. Side sculling uses the position we did earlier. Flat on the ground, face up. Now you want your shoulders square to the sky, paddle against your chest, and moving it back and forth, and you can get your torso in, helping with the motion. Now if you do this on your own, there's a real reluctance to get all the way down to the level of the water, so it helps to have someone spot you. This allows you to work out the right body orientation and get a feel for the motion of the paddle on the water before you actually have to support the kayak that way. Keep the paddle right against your chest. Okay, now just wave it back and forth. Nice wide strokes. There you go. Now do a little bit of that sculling motion. Angle the paddle. Yep. And it's quite possible to end up doing a perfect side scull until the person who's supporting you tells you that they're not holding on. All right. That's good. Now I'll tell you what, I'm going to let go of the kayak. All right? Let go. When you start to sink while you're sculling, there's an instinctive tendency we all have to tense up and go a lot faster with shorter strokes. And that just makes it worse. So what you need to do is reprogram your head to develop a reflex that when there's trouble, you need to relax and go a lot wider. So just think, relax and go wide. So here you see the paddle close to the chest, arching the back very strongly. Shoulders as close as I can get to horizontal, and nice wide strokes. Twisting the torso to add to the width of the stroke. Angling the blade in each direction so I get lift both ways. Got my chin up, head back, nice and relaxed. If you're angling the paddle properly, the kayak swings back and forth but points roughly in the same direction, assuming there's no wind involved. But here, I'm only getting lift as the paddle sweeps towards the bow. As I draw it back, the blade is flat to the surface, and this makes the kayak spin around in a circle, and side sculling takes twice as much effort. Now here I've got a nice wide sweep, paddles going parallel to nearly perpendicular, but I'm making it harder for myself because I've got that gunnel straight up in the air 90 degrees. If I arched my back and flattened the kayak out more, it'd be easier. So to summarize the points for the side scull, paddle is held close to the chest, arch your back, try to get your shoulders horizontal, keep the stroke wide, swing the torso with the paddle, angle the blade for lift in both directions, and think relax and go wide. If you've gotten very comfortable side sculling, one way to roll is to capsize. Just get into that side sculling position and just keep side sculling until you come up. If you haven't rolled before and you try this, it can be a little disorienting, but once you get your bearings, get the scull happening, and then arch your back, push up with the inside knee, you can work your way up. And by remaining calm underwater, the oxygen in your lungs lasts longer, and you don't tense up and lose your flexibility. And if you can do that with just one long sweep, you have the basic standard Greenland roll. When you can side scull comfortably, the next step is to hold yourself in that position with no motion at all. And this is known as the balance brace. I'll side scull out, go down with a very strong arched back, twisting the face up, reach out with one hand in the middle of the paddle, straight elbow, other arm goes across the back deck, and float right there in the water with my face just out so I can breathe nice and relaxed. And exactly how far to twist your body away from the kayak and how to orient your legs can vary depending on the person and the kayak. With good flexibility on a low enough back deck, you can learn the balance brace with just your arm. But in a higher volume kayak like this one, I've got to come out of the seat a bit and bend my back over the side of the coaming in order to make it work. You've got a working balance brace when you can recover directly. That's done by keeping that elbow relatively straight, pulling down hard in the paddle, and driving that inside knee upright. Points to remember are side scull into position, keep your back arched strongly, grab the paddle mid-shaft with a straight elbow, other arm goes across the back deck, let your head down to the water just up to your face. Another way to roll is to use a balance brace. So you set up like this, go over, and just go into that balance brace position, and then come on up. To set up, the free arm goes under the arm with the paddle, and capsize, let the paddle come up to the surface, then reach out and up with that arm while swinging the torso back and pushing with the legs, and start to bring the kayak upright. So you see here my head is still underwater. Now I'm going to arch the back very strongly, bring the kayak upright, and the free arm goes across the back deck. Now my face is out of water, I'm breathing, I'm in a balance brace, and to finish it off, I swing onto the back deck, and I'm up. Now you need to have the paddle oriented so the blades are flat on the surface of the water. And the way to set up for that is, you can either come up and let the paddle float till it's flat on the surface, and then come up, or you can put it down in the water this way, grab onto it like this, then bring it over here with the same grip. That way you know when you go around and come over, it'll be oriented the proper position. Remember, this is about flexibility and finesse, not muscle and power. There are three things to keep in mind no matter what type of layback roll you are doing. The first has to do with the setup position. You want to lean forward and towards the side you'll capsize on. The idea is to hold that position until you come up on the other side. Now if you don't do that, here's what happens. I'm going over, but you see there, I moved the paddle too soon. And now I'm sweeping out, but I'm on the wrong side, just getting disoriented, and the roll fails. So what you have to do is wait till you come up on the far side before you start to sweep. The second thing is the action of the legs and hips. To see that, we use a big sit on top, which is fitted with leg straps. Otherwise, I just fall right out as soon as I turned over. Notice how my chest and shoulders twist in one direction, while my hips and legs go the other way. And that's what's going on inside the kayak that you normally can't see. It plays a much bigger part in rolling than what the hands and arms do. You've got to drive the kayak over with your legs before you bring your head up. Final point for layback rolls is to end as you see here, flat on the back deck, fully reclined. But the way you get there is not by bringing your head up into the air and laying back down on the deck, but coming right across the gunnel like this. Try to slide your shoulders right up over the side. So to recap the points for the layback rolls, hold the setup position until you come all the way around. Drive with the hips and knees to bring the kayak up before your head comes out. And fully recline onto the back deck. The simplest layback roll is the standard Greenland roll. And in this roll, the action of the torso, thighs, and head plays a much bigger part than the arms and elbows. This kind of motion with the elbows is not part of the standard Greenland roll. You can get a kayak to roll this way, but the Greenland roll takes less energy, uses a smoother motion, and has less chance of injury. So to set up, you have the paddle fully extended against the gunnel, palms down, and then I'm leaning forward with my head down. I'm going to capsize towards the paddle, and as we saw before, I'm holding that position from going in until I come all the way around to the other side. The next point to remember is to keep the paddle close to the chest. And you see as I come around here, that arm is bent, paddle right against the chest, head down and back. I'm not pushing that elbow out. That's because, as you can see here, with the sit on top, I'm driving the paddle over by twisting with my body. So looking at the full roll, you see the setup, paddle against the gunnel, going over, and there's the paddle coming up on the other side. Paddle sweeps out, and you'll see now just as the paddle starts to dive is when I'm pushing with the hips. And as part of that motion, I'm keeping the head way back and down. Now finally, as I sweep out, that outside hand needs to be tilted back at the wrist. This creates the proper blade angle to get lift with the paddle. This is a recreational kayak, which is a bit wider, but more importantly, it's got a higher back deck, so you can't lay flat down while staying in the seat. But the way it's done is to come up out of the seat, then drop back down at the end of the roll. So to recap the specific points for the standard roll, we have to lean forward to start, keep the paddle close to the chest as we come up, and keep the wrist tilted back. Layback rolls are easiest in a kayak with a very low back deck. Not all kayaks have a back deck like that. There are several ways to alleviate the restrictions of a high back deck, as we'll see. To begin with, nobody said that you had to stay in the seat the whole time you rolled. So when I come sweeping back, at the end, I'll just lift right out of the seat and lay all the way back on the back deck. Another thing you can do with a high back seat is to loosen the straps as much as you can to lean that back farther. And if your particular kayak allows you, you can actually take the back of the seat out completely. Another thing you can do is pad the edge there so it's more comfortable when you lay back on it. Another thing you can do is to raise the seat a little bit, and that effectively lowers the back deck. So if you put some padding in there, now that I've come up an inch or two, this effectively is going down an inch or two, and I can lay back easier. Now, it does raise the center of gravity of the kayak, so you can only go so far with that technique, but it does help a little bit. Another thing you can do is slide forward in your kayak and readjust your foot pedals here, so that now when you lean back, that high back deck is much farther back and you have a whole degree of range you didn't have before. Now you might not want to do this for distance paddling, but if you're concentrating on rolling alone, that's a good idea. You can modify the kayak, especially if it's a folding kayak. That's what I did. I took out the standard rear rib and I cut another one just an inch or two lower, and that gives me a lower back deck so I can do all the layback rolls on it. And finally, you can buy another kayak, but that's a cop-out. That should be your last resort, not your first resort. The elbow crook roll was done as a way of retaining a knife or other object too valuable to drop during an unexpected capsize. Now that twisting motion, where you're trying to get the paddle all the way to the other gunnel, can be difficult if you've put in too much outfitting. You need a little bit of room in there for your hips to twist around. So if you've filled in every square centimeter with foam, you might want to back off on some of that to give yourself a little bit of maneuvering space. Set up, bringing the paddle all the way to the gunnel and holding it there. Come up on the other side, then lay back as per the standard Greenland roll. And you'll see the hips twisting the kayak over as I swing around on the back. This is a real test of whether or not you're rolling with your torso or using your arms and elbows. It's also possible to do this roll in one of these kayaks. If you can't get the paddle all the way to the gunnel, just keep it pointed forward. And with a very strong sweep and a full layback, you'll be successful. If you're having trouble with the twist to set up, try it this way on the back of your hand. And eventually work it down your arm until you can keep it in your elbow. So points to remember for the elbow crook roll are: set up with a strong twist, and remember you can learn via the back of the hand version if necessary. Rolling with the paddle held behind your neck shouldn't be too difficult if you've got the standard roll working using your body, not your arms. To set up, we're going to fully extend the paddle, put it behind the head on the back of the neck, and now bring the end of the paddle to the opposite gunnel and capsize towards it. And like the other rolls, we're going to hold that position till we come all the way up on the other side. To position myself properly here, I'm curling forward to bring my face right up to the surface of the water before I start sweeping with the paddle. And you'll see here I'm starting the paddle sweeping, really drive the hips over and come around to the back deck. It may help to think of your spine and shoulder blades as controlling the paddle rather than your hands. So from this position right here, twisting up, forcing that paddle around just in my shoulder blades and spine to get all the way onto the back deck. Summarization is: paddle against the neck, fully extended, curl to the surface before the sweep starts, and think of your spine and shoulders controlling the paddle. The shotgun roll uses just one arm on the paddle, and this is a useful roll to learn because it is the building block for the layback throwing stick and hand rolls. Paddle is held against the shoulder like this, not like this, and set up by taking the paddle diagonally across the front deck, capsize toward your empty hand. You want to sweep with the palm facing upward. And if you've got the paddle tucked into your shoulder, it's a natural motion to keep the palm facing upward. During the sweep, the top shoulder twists backwards. So you see that shoulder right there is going to drop back as I twist my body. And as the kayak comes over, I keep my head back and my chin up. In a wide kayak like this, I'll use my other hand and bring both arms on the paddle to push down. And with no obstructions on the back deck, I can just lay out flat in the ideal position for ending layback rolls. So recap the major points for the shotgun roll: hold the paddle against your shoulder, sweep with the palm up, and top shoulder twist backwards, and keep the head back and chin up. The spine roll is done, holding the paddle against your back, right in line with your spine. Now this is not where you want your arm to be to prevent dislocation. But remember, we're dancing, we're not fighting. So you don't muscle your way through, you use finesse, and that way your shoulders don't get injured. This roll you pretty much have to do with the paddle fully extended. That lower hand needs to be as far up your back as you can comfortably reach. The upper hand, as in a standard green roll, is going to tilt back as it sweeps around. So you see right there that wrist is tilted back to keep the blade angle at the proper orientation. Now watch that lower hand. I bring it a little to one side to make it easier to sweep the paddle. Now watch here how I swing the paddle diagonally from the spine before I bring it up at the end, back in parallel. With a high back deck, you can't really keep the paddle flat against your back the whole time. So what you do is come around to about here, then push down with that upper hand to get your body out of the water. This brings the kayak fully upright, then the paddle comes up afterwards. And in doing that, you may find that since the paddle is slightly underwater, it helps to twist the blade 9 degrees before you bring it back up to your spine. To summarize for the spine roll, lower hand is held high, upper wrist tilts back, paddle can go diagonal to the spine, and if necessary, raise your body first and feather the paddle out second. The avatak is the sealskin float that a hunter would have tied to the back deck. And this roll is done as a standard roll with a very strong bracing action. It's tied to the opposite gunnel from the side you'll capsize on. And if you don't use a very powerful stroke, you get up, but that float will just take you back down again, and the roll fails. So to do a strong, powerful standard roll, set up the usual way, come around, let the paddle get to the surface, roll up with the normal standard roll. Now here, I'm upright, but the float is still on the other side of the kayak. So the key is to use a secondary twist of the hips at the end of the roll. And you'll see here how much I've twisted the kayak further than I normally would to bring that float around. Here's a back view. I'm coming around, and here I'm up. I've just got to give that extra kick. So to summarize for the avatak roll, use a very powerful standard roll and add a secondary twist of the hips. The standard Greenland roll done for speed involves doing as many of them as you can in 10 seconds. And you get speed by using a lot more brace than sweep. Some people grab some air each time they come up, other people hold their breath for the duration. By only partially extending the paddle, there's less blade to pull out of the water right here, and I build up a little more speed that way. The technique does get a little sloppy, and you'll see that I'm not coming fully onto the back deck. This is another concession to doing as many of them as possible, rather than making them look really smooth. And make sure you have enough space when you do this so you don't collide with anything. So to summarize, use more brace than sweep, and extend the paddle only partially. Doing a layback roll with a throwing stick uses the same motion as the shotgun roll. I like to hold the throwing stick at the narrowest end to give myself as much surface area on the other end as I can get. Set up as per the shotgun roll with the elbow straight. Capsize, bring the throwing stick to the surface. Then sweep out wide with a straight elbow. You see how my head is down and the kayak has been driven upright with my legs before I bring my face out of the water. And finish with a full recline on the back deck. If the full sweep back doesn't get you up, it's possible to flip around with your hand and push down. You should be able to come up with your palm up the whole time all the way around if you lay back far enough and tilt the boat upright ahead of time. Here's an aerial view to analyze when that pressure with the legs is applied. I'm sweeping out, kayak is still overturned. I'm going to drive with the legs to bring the kayak upright. And in slow motion you see I hold that position on the deck until I come all the way around, start sweeping out, and you see right about there is when I drive with the legs, which is just a little bit before the arm is perpendicular. If you're having trouble, you can use both hands to brace with before you throw the free hand to the other side. The layback throwing stick roll is the learning progression which leads to the layback hand roll. So to review, hold the throwing stick at the small end, use your arm in a shotgun roll motion, and it's a learning progression the other hand can help. Some people recommend opening your eyes underwater to learn rolling so you can see where the paddle is, where the surface of the water is. It can be useful as a learning technique, but you don't want it to become a crutch later on, because you can't assume that you're always going to be able to see underwater. The way I learn to roll is, as soon as I'm underwater, I shut my eyes and I keep them closed until I come up, and that's the way I do to this day. You've also noticed that in this video I haven't been using nose plugs at all. And they're also a useful learning tool, but you don't want to get too dependent on them, and you want to eventually wean yourself off of them so you'll be ready for the real world. To apply these rolls to real world conditions, we have to deal with things like wind. Now, wind blowing on the side of your kayak makes it hard to roll up on one side and easy to roll up on the other side. But if you're underwater, there's not much point in trying to remember which side the wind was blowing on. It's better to just roll up, and if it doesn't work on one side, come up on the other side. But that does mean that you need to know how to roll on both sides of the kayak. So I came up with this procedure to teach yourself the offside roll. If you can do it on one side, you've proven that you in that kayak with that paddle can do the roll. So there's a method to teaching the other side, and here's how it works. So you get out in the water and roll on your on side and do a couple of these till everything feels really smooth. And then when you're ready, switch to the off side and just think carefully about taking that same motion, flipping it to the other side in your head. And if the offside fails, as it usually does, recover and go back to the onside and do a couple of the onside ones. And this is just reinforcing in your mind the proper motion. And after you do a couple on the onside, then go back to the offside again. And if you miss an offside, just go back to the onside, keep going back, and eventually that offside will work. Might not be real smooth, but when that happens, go back to the onside, do another one of those, then switch to the offside again. And if you keep working it like this, eventually the offside gets as strong as the onside. And even if this technique doesn't work, the side effect is that the onside gets very strong. The other factor is timing. That's knowing exactly when to initiate the righting action of the hips in relation to where the paddle is on the water. And you can only really lock that in with practice and experience. But you can do some experimentation. If in your standard Greenland roll, you're coming out and you're snapping too early, the paddle is more out here, whereas you want it to be farther out 90 degrees. To experiment on your own, just sweep out and then wait till longer than you thought it would be to snap up. And if that doesn't make it easier, try doing it sooner. And with that sort of experimentation, you can figure out on your own where that optimum position will be. Word of caution: no matter how good you think you can roll, there's no such thing as being absolutely bomb-proof. If you somehow wound up upside down unconscious, there's just no way you're going to come back up. So there's no substitute for common sense and good sound judgment. So wherever you practice rolling, be sure there's no underwater obstructions you could hit your head on, and also be aware of hazards such as jellyfish or fishing lines or motorboats. If you practice rolling in cold water, what I do is take one attempt at a new move, and if that doesn't work, immediately go for the tried and true and get back up. You don't want to be staying underwater too long when it's really cold. So, for example, if I had trying a new Norsk roll, I would go over, if it didn't make it, immediately grab the paddle and come back up. It's just not a good idea to take 3 or 4 attempts at some new technique in cold water on one breath of air. This, what I'm wearing, is a Greenlandic, and these were originally made of seal skin, and it seals tightly around the face, tightly around the wrists, And it is the actual spray skirt, all one piece. And this is cut so it's very loose and unrestrictive. It allows that full mobility that I need to do all those different rolls. In the wintertime, this is a great thing to wear if you're going to practice in cold water because it keeps you all sealed in. And as long as you don't come out of the kayak, it sort of functions as a dry suit. And this is why in Greenland there was such an infatuation with learning every possible roll, because wet exits just weren't an option in that frigid Arctic water. What I like best about this is it actually keeps the water from getting in your ears, which if you're going to do a lot of rolling, it's nice to avoid that. And for practicing rolling year-round, I recommend this highly. Before we get to the forward-ending rolls, I'd like to demonstrate that these Greenland techniques can be done in very non-traditional kayaks. Layback rolls are only half the fun you can have rolling a kayak. There's a whole other class of rolls that end on the front deck. And for those rolls, the height of this deck back here is completely irrelevant. The range of motion that we looked at before is still going to be used, but instead of rotating our shoulders to face up as we did for the side scull, we're going to twist them down. Rotating the knees is still a critical part of the roll, but it's going to feel different because we're bending the opposite way. For all forward rolls, you want to twist your head and shoulders to face down, because as you can see here, that's how you want to end up. Second point is that the palms ride over the paddle shaft. If you remember in the side scull and layback rolls, you end up underneath the paddle with your palms upward. But here we come over in the same position, but now watch that back hand. It'll turn to face downward, and the hands are riding on top of the paddle as the torso comes up onto the front deck. Another way to visualize it is watch the blue tape. I'm going to set up, come around. Now for a layback roll, I'm going to stay under the paddle with the hands, and you won't see the tape until I'm finished the roll. But I can set up the exact same way and hold the setup till I come around the same way. And for a storm roll, my hands are going to stay on top of the paddle, which means you see the blue tape throughout the sweep. In all forward rolls, you can keep your head in the right orientation if you remember to keep your chin down. Here I can just tuck my chin to my chest and it stays there the whole time. Final point is the path your head takes to get to the front deck. Try to make it as flat as the surface of the water, aiming to bring your cheek to the gunnel rather than going up in the air and back down to the deck. And if you master this technique, you can do forward rolls with a brick in your hand. So the points to remember for forward ending rolls are twist your torso to face down, palms ride over the paddle shaft, keep your chin down, and aim for cheek to gunnel motion. And with these points in mind, we'll look at specific forward ending rolls. The chest scull forms the foundation for all the forward ending rolls. So to do this, I'm turning to face down, shoulders as square as I can get them to the water. You can let your head underwater initially. Eventually you can try to do it keeping your head up. And you'll see a very wide stroke here, wide and relaxed, swinging the torso with the paddle and angling the blade for lift in both directions. To recover, we're going to push down with the outside hand, pull up with the inside hand when we're doing a good strong stroke from back to front. And when this happens, we'll slide the paddle across the deck. And this is true no matter what kind of kayak you're doing this in. So the main points are shoulders horizontal, face down, let your face go underwater, keep the strokes wide, and for the recovery, the outside hand pushes down, inside hand pushes up, slide the paddle onto the deck. The reverse sweep roll is a natural progression of a good chest scull. For the setup, you want to twist around and put the paddle all the way across the back deck to the opposite gunnel. Then capsize backwards and arch your back to come to the surface. Then curl forward and use knee pressure to twist the kayak over and bend towards the front deck. Notice how I straighten my elbow as I come around. One way to learn this roll is to set up for a reverse sweep, go under, and then just get in position for a chest scull once you find your bearings, and just keep sculling until you get up. So the points to remember are set up in a full twist, capsize backwards, straighten out your elbow, and recover like a chest scull. Once you get a feel for the forward ending rolls, doing one with the paddle behind your neck isn't that difficult. I like to do it with a little more brace than sweep. Set up, twist into the side, paddle on the opposite gunnel. And you see I'm going to sweep the paddle out about that far, then brace really hard right here. And we'll look at that again, and you can see how hard I brace with my knees right at the end there. In a hard shine traditional Greenland skin-on frame, you may have problems with this roll and actually getting the kayak to fully capsize. So what you need to do is twist with your knees and hips to get into the water and bring the kayak over on top of yourself. And if you wiggle a little bit and take your time with it, you can manage to get your body to float up on the other side, and you can complete the roll. So the main points are: twist behind to the far gunnel, capsize backwards, arch your back towards the surface, and try a hard brace after a slight sweep. The storm roll starts leaning forward on the front deck, and it ends leaning forward on the front deck. If your layback rolls are very instinctive, your first storm roll tends to look like this, which for the record is not a storm roll. So to analyze why, here we're setting up, and now as we go into it, my hands are turning to palm upward instead of palm downward, and my head is facing up rather than down, and just because I come forward at the end does not make it a storm roll. So here's a real storm roll, and watch, my hands are going to ride on top of the paddle, palms facing downward, and my head turns downward, and I come up right onto the front deck. Now notice also that that back hand is keeping the paddle in contact with the kayak for the duration of the roll. Also notice how far under the kayak I reach with that hand. If I swept from here, the paddle would dive too much. So I'm reaching underneath, and now I use that torso flexibility and really get that whole elbow up onto the gunnel. That keeps the paddle on the surface, and I get the full mileage out of the sweep rather than just bracing the whole way. And remember to park your chin on your chest and hold it there until the end of the roll. So to review, the hands ride on top of the paddle, head turns to face down, chin stays on the chest, paddle stays in contact with the kayak throughout. There are a number of things you can do to make forward ending rolls easier, and probably the biggest one is increase your forward flexibility. To do these rolls, you want to be able to lean forward as far as you can, and ideally this kind of stretch down, palms to the ground sort of thing. Now you can do these rolls without that kind of flexibility. You can still get the basic storm roll to work, even if you only got this much, but the more you have the better, and you can work up over time to really stretch. So every morning, just go down, touch your toes, work a little bit farther, and over the course of several months, you can develop that. The second thing you can do is, here's a little experiment. If you evaluate how far you can reach, everybody's just got sort of a point where they get to, and that's about as far as they go. But look at this. As soon as I move my knees out wider, I can get my head down a couple more inches. Try it yourself. And what that means in the kayak is, the wider you've got your knees apart, the easier the forward rolls are going to become, which means that wider kayaks have a slight advantage. Also that if you need to reorient your outfitting or just take advantage of every amount of width that you have in order to get the knees as wide as possible to give you all the range you can get leaning forward. Third factor has to do with the height of the seat. Now if you can modify it at all, for the layback rolls, we talked about raising the seat. Forward ending rolls, the lower the seat is, the easier the roll is going to get. And that has to do with the center of gravity, in that if I'm coming up here, I want to be as close as I can get to the deck. But if I'm up in the air, there's more weight to try to bring up out of the water. The lower I am, the more that this weight is keeping me down, and the easier it is to just come right up and over. So in a kayak like this, where you've actually got a web suspended, you can sew a different one, a foam seat, you can take it out. If you notice the skin on frames, it's usually the paddler sits right on the floor, right on the bottom of the kayak. So you're getting as much advantage as you can, but a lot of other kayaks you buy have a fairly higher seat. So if you can get that seat low as possible, that helps the forward ending rolls. The fourth thing you can do, and this actually applies to both forward ending rolls and layback rolls, is use whatever available space you have shifting side to side. And the way it works is, if I'm going to go over on this side and come up on this side, to set up, I want to push myself as far as I can over to that side. So I'm sliding my hips right against the inside here. And what happens there is when I come up on this side, again, it's like a balancing seesaw sort of thing. The more weight I have over here, the easier it is to bring this up over here. So by pushing my hips to that side, when I come up on this side, it makes it that much easier. If I was all the way out over here trying to come up, I tend to sink down easier. So by sliding myself over to this side, I come up better. And here again, a wider kayak has a slightly better advantage than a very narrow kayak. So if you're sitting right against the gunnels on both sides in something that's like 19 inches or so, this really doesn't come into play. But for a wreck boat or something like that, you really want to use every available bit of space you can. There is one more factor that makes forward ending rolls easier, but that only comes into play on advanced rolls with, say, hand, Norsk, and ones like that. And so we will cover that in volume 2. In this maneuver, you have 10 seconds to do as many storm rolls as you can. Smooth technique is sacrificed for sheer quantity. You can see that the paddle isn't staying in contact with the kayak, nor am I fully leaning onto the front deck except for the very end here. Here's a regular storm roll, and you can see the full sweep of the paddle. But doing them quickly in succession here, instead of that wide sweep, we're using a very hard brace, and you see the paddle goes almost completely vertical. You can also try using a partial sliding stroke. So you're gripping the paddle closer to the end when riding the kayak, and more towards the middle when pulling the paddle out of the water and plunging it in again on the other side. So for speed storm rolls, use a hard brace with a very short sweep, and try a partial sliding stroke. The cross-arm roll originated as a way of coping with a harpoon line entangling the arms in a capsize. Set up with the top hand forward, hold the paddle against the gunnel, and then similar to a storm roll, I'm going to pry the paddle against the kayak to bring myself up on the front deck. And this roll is unique in that the arm that's driving the paddle over is the arm that comes out of the water first, unlike all the other rolls. So here's a learning progression that may work for you. I'm going to set up like this, go down and come up on the same side, but only use the opposite arm. So drop in, then smack the paddle against the water, and come up right in the front deck nice and low. Here's a side view. Where you put that paddle against the kayak makes a difference. You want to go not too far forward, not too close, but right there in the sweet spot. Now try that as a full 360, starting with the paddle parallel against the gunnel and then turning it 90 degrees to recover. The full cross-arm roll is the same idea, but with your other hand intertwined, which limits how far you can bring the active blade out of the water when initiating the brace, but you can compensate for that by adding a bit of sweep to the brace. So the key points for the cross-arm roll: set up with the forward arm on top, pry the paddle against the gunnel, and try the one-arm learning progression. Rolling with the paddle held behind the back is one of the trickier forward-ending rolls. Set up with the paddle held against the gunnel, behind your back with the hands palms up. Because we've got the paddle behind our back, this is an exception to having the palms face downward for forward-ending rolls. Hold the setup position until you come all the way to the other side. I've got the paddle still against the gunnel and it's out of the water. Before I apply pressure with the hips, I'm just going to sweep the paddle 4 or 5 inches. And notice how my wrist is tilted back. The initial sweep just lets me know that I've got the blade at the right orientation. Then I can start driving the kayak over. And right here I'm really pulling with the abdominals. It's like the muscles you use when you do a sit-up to the opposite knee. Notice the wrists here end up bending forward, and they have to rotate as I come around to keep pressure on the blade. So look at it from this angle. As I come around, the wrists are tilted back, and once I've got the sweep started, I'm adjusting the angle, and I end up with the wrists bent in the other direction. Come up keeping the head as close to the kayak as possible, and like all forward ending rolls, having a high back deck doesn't make a difference. Set up with the palms up, paddle against the gunnel, start the sweep to feel lift, wrists are tilted back, pull with the abdominals, the wrists tilt forward at the end. The throwing stick roll starting forward and ending forward is known as Norsk masikut. I like to grip the Norsk at the narrow end all the way down, giving myself as much area as far away from the hand as I can to get all the leverage I can from the side of the kayak. So the components of this are, there's a stretch, and that's where you want to get this way out there, and you need your whole torso to come out together. So it's like you're stretching for that rebound. Then there's the snap, where when I push this down, I'm going to twist the knees at the same time in one motion. Then the follow through is, this doesn't just push down, it sweeps all the way down and underneath and ends up right underneath the kayak with my head on the front deck. Set up with the Norsk held against your forehead like this. And here's the stretch out to the side as far as I can reach. And here's the snap, pushing down with the Norsk and driving the kayak around with my knees. I've got my head out to the side, but I need to bring my torso into the kayak as fast as possible. And finish with the very important ending as a continuous arc, putting pressure on the Norsk all the way to the underside of the kayak. You can try this holding the paddle in one hand. That way you can spot yourself, and if there's a problem, just roll up with the paddle. The points to remember are, hold the Norsk at the narrow end, stretch the arm to the surface with a straight elbow, synchronize the arm pressure with the hip and knee drive, and the arm follows a wide arc ending at the keel. The throwing stick roll starting back and ending forward is known as Norsk. Set up reaching back to the opposite gunnel and capsize backwards. Since the Norsk has a greater distance to travel than if we were starting leaning forward, we can use that extra excursion to generate more lift. So I've got the Norsk at the proper angle to plane against the water, and look how far over the kayak is before my arm is where it would be for the front-to-front version of a Norsk roll. To achieve the exact positioning, there's a very effective elbow motion. When I come around, I bend my arm as if I'm going to touch the back of my head. This keeps the Norsk near the surface, and I could even start driving with my knees before I stretch out with the arm. The snap and follow-through are the same as before. Bring the Norsk all the way under to the keel. And the main points are set up reaching around to the opposite gunnel, capsize backwards, bend the elbow towards the head when initiating the sweep, and follow through with an arc to the keel. An alternative method of learning these Greenland techniques is to start with a kayak that's very optimized for rolling. And if you go to some of the festivals or symposiums around the country with a Kayak USA presence, we may have some Greenland skin-on frames with a very low back deck, very low volume designs that roll very easily. So if you get into one of these kayaks, we'll fit you in with the right one. And especially the layback rolls become very easy. And you may be hitting hand rolls in a matter of minutes maybe. So if you look for either me or some of the other Kayak USA folks at some of these events, we'll be happy to show you that method. But in this video, we're emphasizing making do with what you have, which is a very good technique if you don't have anyone in your area to show you these things. Volume 2 of this video covers several sculling rolls, as well as rolls that don't use a paddle at all. rolling with your hands, rolling with your fists closed, rolling while you're holding a brick, and more. Here's a preview of several of these rolls, and it starts out with my favorite roll of all. It's called Masikut a la Chinook. So in closing, I don't want to leave the impression that what I've presented in this video is the definitive infallible doctrine on Greenland rolling. On the contrary, what we in the English-speaking world know about traditional techniques has expanded dramatically in the last few decades, and hopefully will continue to grow. This video is one contribution to the overall body of knowledge on the subject, and over time, some of my input may prove to be impractical, inaccurate, or obsolete, but I invite you to pick up the torch and carry on. I myself am only one link in the chain, and I am indebted to all the fine people in the kayaking community and the great pioneers of the past. I'd like to make a special acknowledgement to two of the most important people responsible for the survival of Greenland kayaking, Manessa Matthewson and John Heath. Thank you all, and happy rolling.